tonight is Wayne Rehford, and he brought with him Old Bailey. Now, when I say Old Bailey, it's not his wife. His wife is here too, and her name is Mary, and we're very happy to have both of you here. But Wayne is the executive director of the Scottish Home in Wheaton, and he'll tell you about this Old Bailey that he brought with him as well. And he's going to be speaking as the ghost of George Anderson, and he'll get into that, of course. And when he comes up here, don't feel sorry for him. I don't think he's cold, but, you know, he may look like he's cold. But he's got a kilt on, and it's part of the whole tradition in his talk, and and the history of the Illinois St. Andrews Society that he's part of. So, but without going into the story too much, I'm going to have him come up here and give us our program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is George Anderson. I was born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1813. I came to the city of Chicago in 1845, and I died October the 30th, 1887, and I'm buried with my family in Oakwood Cemetery on the south side of Chicago. I want to talk a little bit about the city of Chicago. When I first arrived, population was less than 10,000. There was no sewer system. In fact, all the sewage went into the Chicago River. There was no central water supply. What water we had to drink came from wells or it came from Lake Michigan. There was no paved streets, no sidewalks. The city was either dust or mud. In the summertime it was dust, in the wintertime it was mud. Chicago, you know, is built on a swamp with all the problems that go with a swamp in terms of the soil, the mosquitoes, the building problems. In fact, during the rainy season, an Indian with a canoe could go all the way overland from the city of Chicago out to the Des Plaines River, which is about 15 miles, to show you how swampy it was. I'll give you the joke of the day, show you how muddy and swampy Chicago is. On State Street, a man is seen from just his shoulders up. And a fellow standing on the sidewalk says to him, "Do you need some help?" And he says, "Oh, no, I'm fine. I have a good horse under me." Not very funny, but it illustrates, I think, the fact that Chicago always had a terrible reputation for mud. Stagecoaches, horses, ladies in long dresses, they fought mud constantly during the city of Chicago. There were a few Scots living here then. Not sure why they came. It was a long journey from Scotland. Very difficult, very arduous trip. Cost a lot of money. And I'm not sure why they came to Chicago, but there was a handful of Scottish people living in the city when I arrived in 1841. A man was here by the name of George McClellan. He was a captain in the United States Army. He was on his way to the Mexican War and finally the Civil War, but of course you didn't know it at that particular moment. He came to Chicago to work on the harbor because just outside the harbor was this huge sandbar. In fact, it was so big that it actually diverted the river, and the entrance to the river was down by Grant Park until they got rid of the sandbar. So McClellan was here working on the sandbar, trying to open up the harbor as a young captain. As we approached St. Andrew's Day, which is October the 30th of every year, he thought it was a good idea to get the Scotsmen all together. And so he issued a call that all the Scottish men, no ladies invited, sorry about that, should gather at the Lake House Hotel and celebrate St. Andrew's Day. Well, the Lake House was a three-story brick building across the Chicago River, about where the Wrigley building is now standing, but except down along the water's edge. And it was Chicago's finest hotel. I mean, they had printed menus, and they had tablecloths on the table, and they brought a chef from back east. In fact, it was so fancy that it never was really a success, but that's where we met. The bartender was a guy from Scotland, so we had plenty to drink. McClellan was living there while he was working on the harbor. And we met, less than 20 of us that night, to celebrate St. Andrew's Day. And we sang, and we ate, and we drank, and we fellowshipped, and we had a good time. And we decided that night that we would form a St. Andrew's Society, much like was already in existence in Boston or Philadelphia or South Carolina. And that's what happened. On January the 26th, 1846, 17 of us met again at the lake house, and we began an organization that still exists. There were 17 there, 16 were elected officers, and one guy went away angry. I have to think that must have been McClellan, who knew he wasn't going to be long in the city of Chicago anyhow, and therefore didn't take an office. I'm sure they would have made one for him if he had wanted to stay. But we began an organization that now is almost 150 years old. And the purpose of the organization was to take care of the Scottish immigrant. We had the city divided into 3 sections, north, south, and west. And it was our job to find Scottish families who were in need. And when we found them, we took them food and clothing and wood for the winter, got them housing, kept the kids in school, found them jobs, gave them medical treatment, whatever was necessary to take care of the Scottish family. We were sort of a localized Red Cross. It was a wonderful work. And I was involved in that work for 40 years until the day I died. It was the one central thing in my life. We had a mission statement. And our mission statement was that no deserving person of Scottish descent seeking aid would ever go hungry or homeless or be buried in a potter's field. To take care of that last statement, we went up to Rose Hill Cemetery on the north side a year before it opened, and we bought a huge plot of land right at the very entrance to the cemetery. And tonight there are more than 200 Scottish men and women and children who are buried in Rose Hill Cemetery, who otherwise, without the good graces of the St. Andrew's Society, would have ended up in a potter's field. If you read my obituary, you would note that I was an early-day supporter of Abraham Lincoln, and that in the Chicago area I had a small amount of fame in giving speeches against slavery. I gave my oldest son, Alexander, in fact, at the Battle of Memphis. He's buried in the family plot in Oak Woods. In 1871, I was now 58 years old. I was a postmaster on South State Street. 22nd and South State Street was a post office, and that's where I worked. I was so angry, however, at the election of Grover Cleveland that I quit my job. I couldn't understand how anyone could have voted for Grover Cleveland, and I absolutely refused to serve in his administration, and so I resigned. I quit, being the stubborn Scot that I am, and I decided I would go back to Scotland to visit. I'd not been home now in 40 years. And my one goal was to go back to my homeland and visit one more time before death overtook me, and that's what I decided to do. Before I left, my friends in the St. Andrew's Society, which numbered, I have to tell you, some of the wealthiest men in the city of Chicago, Cyrus McCormick, Philip Armour, John Crayar, were all Scots, and were all members of the St. Andrew's Society. They were extremely wealthy men, and they were the ones who supplied the money that let the rest of us go out and take the food and the clothing and pay the rent and get medical care for the rest of the Scots. They gave me a farewell party, and they presented me with some very wonderful gifts, and they wished me Godspeed on my journey. I want to leave George Anderson now on his trip to Scotland. He went to England and traveled through England and went back to Scotland and traveled his homeland. And I want to leave him over there for a while and bring you back now to the city of Chicago. It was a long, hot, dry summer, that summer in '71. They'd had very little rain. And those 300,000 people living in the city were in constant fear of fire. The prairies west of town, which stretched out as far as the eye could see, were often ablaze with fire. And the inhabitants of Chicago lived in daily fear that something terrible was going to happen to them. Because you see, it was a wooden city. All the houses were wood. The streets were paved with wood. The sidewalks were wood. They burned wood for fuel. I don't know if you knew it or not, but at that particular time, Chicago was the largest producer of wood products in the entire world. All up and down the north and south branches of the Chicago River were these huge lumber mills, and there was stacked lumber everywhere. And ships were tied up in the river, all loaded with lumber, dry as timber. And so the people knew that they were living on the verge of something terrible happening to them. The fire actually began on Saturday in the western portion of the city. It consumed about 4 blocks. The firemen had worked long and hard and put that fire out, but they were tired and exhausted, and some of their machinery had broken. And when they went home that night, they prayed that God would not send another blaze along. But you know what happened. About 9 o'clock on Sunday evening, back behind the O'Leary's house in a barn, a small fire started. Now I know the story that Mrs. O'Leary went out to milk her cow, and the cow kicked over the lantern and caught the hay on fire, and it started. I don't think that's a true story. First of all, if you've ever lived on a farm, you don't start milking at 9 o'clock in the evening. That's already over with, right? I remember that from a kid. We milked at 5. We didn't wait till 9 o'clock. Mrs. O'Leary had several kids, one of which was a man by the name of Jim O'Leary. Big Jim O'Leary was his nickname. He was a gambler and a politician, which seems like a very nice combination for Chicago, doesn't it? Those two sometimes go together. He would later say that the fire actually started because some kids were out smoking in the barn, and they accidentally caught the hay on fire, and it all began. Sounds more reasonable than having a cow kick over the lantern. It was a strong southwest wind blowing, maybe as much as 30 to 40 miles an hour. They called it a devil wind. It took the flames and began to move them from one house to another, from one street to another, from one block to another. By 11:30 that night, it had crossed the river at Van Buren Street, and laying out before it now was the whole downtown section of the city of Chicago. And everything was lost. The courthouse is about where the courthouse is today. On top of it was a cupola with a walk-around. And on that walk-around there was a fireman stationed 24 hours a day who had just one duty, and that was to look for fires. He walked around this thing in shifts looking for fires. He saw the fire all right when it first started, but he thought it was in the old district that had burned, the 4 blocks that had burned earlier, and when he sent the fire department out, he sent them to that area they had previously been to. By the time they realized the mistake and got to where the actual fire was, it was already too late. In fact, I don't think anything could have saved the city. They didn't have the modern kind of fire equipment that we have today, of course. Things were horse-drawn, and there was a shortage of water and pumping equipment. There just nothing could have saved the city. It was ready to go. It destroyed the very heart of Chicago. 4 miles long, 1 mile wide, 1,688 acres, 28 miles of block paving, 121 miles of wooden sidewalks. The fire was so hot that it literally melted the water mains that were below ground. Someone has estimated that the flames near the heart of the fire probably reached 3,000 degrees. I don't know how they reached that decision, but that was something I'd read. Buildings literally exploded. Those of you who are my age, and I look over the crowd, and some of you are, We'll remember the pictures of the atomic bombs and how the buildings just sort of exploded and disintegrated. That's what happened to Chicago at the height of this fire. Bricks melted. Buildings just seemed to fall and be destroyed and disintegrated within just a moment of time as it all swept northward across the city. The gasworks blew up with a tremendous explosion. It didn't spread the fire much any further, but it was a tremendous explosion. And those 300,000 people living in the city of Chicago knew that all hope was lost. And they fled northward, they fled southward, they fled west out into the prairies. Many of them ran to the lakes and stood in the water. And of course, with all the burning embers and the wind and everything that was around them, that really wasn't the safest place to go. The lighthouse that was out there almost caught on fire from the embers that were blown about. The fire just consumed everything within its sight. Think about it for a moment. Every major hotel, every theater, the courthouse, the post office, the huge grain elevators, the railroad depots, the thousands of homes that were in the heart of the city, everything was gone, literally in just a moment of time. The newspaper says that I have the only eyewitness account of the Great Chicago Fire, and that really is not absolutely correct. What I have is a description that's never been published. It was written by a Scottish man. Could have been written by George Anderson. He obviously had some writing skills. I don't know who wrote this. This appeared in the 1872 annual report of the Illinois St. Andrews Society, and it's an eyewitness account of the fire. I won't insult your intelligence to read it all to you, but could I just read a portion of it? Because it describes it far better than I could ever do. From the numerous dispatches received, it appears that there were two fires. The first broke out in the western division of the city and consumed 4 blocks before it was extinguished. On Saturday night, October the 8th, about 10 o'clock, another fire commenced not far from the ruins left by the former, and the flames, urged by a strong southwest wind and fed by blocks of wooden buildings and miles of wooden streets, rushed with irresistible fury over the river through the very heart of the city, leaped the Chicago River a second time, and with widening current, sweeping everything before them until their course was stayed by the waters of Lake Michigan. Then the wind changed to the north, and the southern portion of the city was threatened with destruction. During the whole of Saturday night, all day Monday and Monday night, the fire continued to burn, and it was only on Tuesday morning that its progress was stayed. Men who were millionaires are penniless today. But more terrible than all this is the awful certainty that many human beings have perished in the flame. How many? No one can tell. Perhaps no one will ever be able to tell. But it is known that some have perished, and there is only a heart-sickening fear that the victims of the fiery monster may be counted by the score. Hundreds of horses and cows have been burned in stables, and on the north side, numbers of animals, though released from confinement, were so bewildered and confused by the sea of fire which surrounded them that they rushed wildly to and fro, uttering cries of fright and pain until scorched and killed. A few minutes sufficed to destroy the most elaborately built structures. The walls melted. The very bricks were consumed. The wooden pavement took fire, making a continuous sheet of flame 2 miles long and a mile wide. No human being could possibly survive many minutes. Block after block fell, and the red-hot coals shot higher and higher and spread further and further until the north side of Lake Street was a vast sheet of flame from the river to the lake at one time, and so hymned the people that it was expected that thousands must perish. The Sherman, Tremont, and other hotels were emptied of their guests, and a remarkable sight presented itself in the hurrying of throngs with trunks, sacks, or bags on their shoulders, fleeing amid flames for their lives. And one more paragraph. This was the sight by night. One fireproof building, the Chicago Tribune building, seemed likely to escape, but by 10 o'clock in the forenoon, this remaining block was in ashes. Now was to be seen the most remarkable sight ever beheld in this or any country. There were from 50 to 75,000 men, women, and children fleeing by every available street and road to the southward and westward, attempting to save their clothing and their lives. Every available vehicle was brought into requisition for use, for which enormous prices were paid, and the streets presented a sad sight. Thousands of persons and horses inextricably commingled, poor people of all colors and shades and every nationality, from Europe, China, and Africa, mad with excitement, struggling with each other to get away. During Monday, a renewal of the fires on the west side was looked for, and a change of 5 degrees in the direction of the wind at any time would have led to that result. There would have been no refuge in the city for any. Everyone had their clothing packed, ready to start for the prairies at any moment, but God averted this latest possible addition to the disaster. And then he goes on to describe the condition of the people. And he says, the condition of the population at the date of our last reports were deplorable. There were thousands of people camped along the artesian wells 4 miles out, and perhaps as many more at the lake. And on Fullerton and Victory Avenue near the prairies, the people were being fed in the remaining churches, schoolhouses, and sheds, and by the roadside. It was cold and chilly, causing great suffering, but instead of this being welcomed, the people were praying earnestly for more rain. So fearful were they of a continuance of the flames. This was the situation at noon on Tuesday. There are lots of stories about the fire. The editor of the Prairie Farmer, which is an old magazine that may still be published, I'm not sure. He lost his 2 teenage girls and couldn't find them. And in his search for the girls, he became so excited that he literally became insane. He spent the rest of his life in a mental institution, and the girls were fine. They were perfectly safe. A family of 6, an Oriental family, fleeing northward from the flames with small children and an elderly grandmother. The elderly grandmother was an invalid, and they were having trouble taking her and the kids and keeping ahead of the flames, and they were crossing the last bridge across the river, and they had to make a decision. Was it better to leave the grandmother behind and let her die in the flames, or was it more humane to drop her over the river and let her drown in the Chicago River? A tough decision. I've always been consumed about this idea of the Grand Pacific Hotel. It stood where the Continental Bank now stands downtown, except I guess the Continental Bank will have a new name change before long. It was a 6-story building, olive-tinted Ohio sandstone. It had a place where you could drive the carriage in and get out of the weather, and there was a huge glass dome over this entranceway. They had what they called an electric annunciator attached to all the 500 rooms, so if you had a message down at the desk, they could call you in your room, a new modern invention. They also had what they called a vertical railway to connect all the floors. We call it an elevator these days. The hotel was ready to be opened on Monday morning. All the rooms were finished, lavishly decorated. The dining room was set. Fine china had been brought from France. Everything was in readiness for the grand opening on Monday morning, and the hotel was totally and completely destroyed before it ever admitted one single guest. And on the stories go. lootings, there were robberies, there was drunkenness. Men would break into the liquor stores and the saloons and take the booze and stand out on the street and drink it until they were absolutely gone, and then would jump and yell and scream at the flames as they grew nearer. It was almost a mad frenzy of 100,000 people trying to escape their doom. I have a list of Scottish losses, and Mary and I, of course, have been interested in what happened to Scottish people. And let me give you some of these just to give you some idea of what people lost. And you'll have to remember now, these are 1871 prices. Robert Hervey, who had a condominium on Michigan Avenue, lost his valuable law library. Thomas Dougal, who had a soap factory on Elm Street, lost it all. As did Hugh Ritchie, who had a soap factory on Grand Haven Street. James Thompson lost 9 houses and furniture at Wells and Dearborn. John Alston lost his paint company at 172 Randolph, valued at $200,000. Mr. Barnett lost his brass foundry at Franklin Street. William Henry, a watchmaker, lost his stock. Alex Murray, a plumber, lost $3,000. Hugh Cooper, a tailor, lost his stock and furniture. Thomas Hasty lost boots and shoes and stock and $60,000 in United States government bonds, which he could never replace again. If you know much about Chicago history, you'll recognize the name of Robert Fergus and Sons. They lost their printing house and residence, value $75,000. John McGlasson lost his furniture store. Fred Smith lost his agricultural instrument making company. William Dale, a druggist, lost his stock valued at $10,000. Cyrus McCormick, what a great story Cyrus McCormick is. He lost his huge plant where the Reaper was being built just across the river where the Tribune building now stands. I have to go back now to get George Anderson. George had been traveling through England and Scotland. He'd gone back home to Glasgow to visit his family. And he has made his way northward to the little city of Perth, along a beautiful river. Mary and I were there 2 years ago. And he had gone to visit the old castle. And after he'd made the tour of the castle, someone said to him, "Would you like to see the armament and the curiosities that are down in the basement?" And he said he would. And they took him downstairs where there was armor and various other things that I'm not sure what he saw. Mary and I tried to find the castle when we were in Perth 2 years ago, and none of the people really was sure which castle he was talking about. And they're wandering around all of these things down in the basement. And he sees on the wall a ram's head. And he says half aloud, almost to himself, and to his guests who were with him, "If I could find a ram's head like that, I would have it adorned with silver and give it to my friends in the Illinois St. Andrews Society back in Scotland." And he had scarcely uttered those words until either a man by the name of Bailey or a man whose position was a bailiff in a court took the ram's head off the wall and handed it to him. And George Anderson brought it back to the city of Chicago, and believe it or not, I have it right here, covered up in the ancient Anderson tartan. George happened to live on the south side. Do you know where the Douglas Monument is? If you go up Lakeshore Drive, along about 35th Street, you can see the large Douglas Monument. That was the area that George Anderson lived in. And of course, he escaped all the fire. The ram's head escaped because he had the ram's head at his house. Because his plans were that when the St. Andrews Society met on October the 30th for their annual dinner, he would give them the ram's head. In between all of that came the disaster of the fire. The St. Andrews Society met after the fire on October the 30th, as they always did, as we just did this last year. In fact, now for 148 years, Scottish people in Chicago have been meeting. We met at the Chicago Hilton. about 700 of us, and enjoyed an evening the same as they did in 1845. And they had their dinner that night, but it was all different. Their world had been destroyed. Their businesses were gone. Everything was lost. And those men who had been millionaires a few weeks before were now, as he says in the writing, penniless. But they ate and they drank. And at the appropriate time, George Anderson said, "I have a presentation I want to make to you." A man by the name of John Marshall was the president at that time. He had been a general during the Civil War and was serving as the postmaster of Chicago. And he said to him, "I'm going to give you something, and every New Year's Day, you have to have this on your dining room table. And every time the St. Andrew's Society meets at its annual meeting, you have to have this thing present." I'm going to show you the ram's head. He's a terribly ugly thing. But just because of who he is, he's wonderful. He's adorned with silver, Cairngorm stone. He's really a humidor. He has wheels on the bottom, and at the annual banquet, they would wheel him along the table, and you could either have a cigar, or you could have a pinch of snuff, or you could pat him on the nose for good luck and pass him along to the next guest. It's my pleasure. I don't know how old he is. He's now more than 100 years old, we know. But it's my pleasure to show you now Old Bailey, the mascot of the Illinois St. Andrew's Society. Isn't he a beauty? And when you come up after a while to see him, you will note that this says, "Presented by George Anderson to the Illinois St. Andrew's Society as a token of his love and esteem," and it's dated October the 30th, 1871. He escaped the fire only because he lived on the south side. If you like a pinch of snuff, you open this lid. If you would like a cigar, you can have a small one back here. I don't guarantee that they're still any good, but you can try one. Not everybody, I have to tell you, was unhappy about the fire. Shortly after the fire was over, the newspaper received a letter from a veteran of the Confederacy. And he wrote these words: "I feel a deep interest in the misfortunes of your city, and would fain to help you all I can. And yet, do you know we owe it, some of my friends and I, to the implacable temper of Chicago troops during the war, that we are now exiles, impoverished and struggling, far from the sepulchres of our father, and without a single heirloom sacred to past affections spared us. It was a Chicago soldier who threw into the flames the likeness of my mother, and tearing a box of invaluable literary memorabilia from the person who held it, consigned the box to the same flaming bed." This man had seen the burning of Atlanta and had lost all that was dear to him, and he thought Chicago was only getting its just rewards. Some people thought that God had judged Chicago because of their sins, and the fire came as a judgment from the righteous one. St. Louis, even though they sent aid, was sort of glad in a way, because there was a lot of rivalry between St. Louis and Chicago, and St. Louis thought, well, now we are at last going to be the greatest town on the Mississippi. And they were wrong, of course. I guess putting the city together is probably as great a story as it is of it burning. Can you imagine? Everything was done by hand. All the bank records, all the deposits, all the checks, all the records at the courthouse were all done in hand. There were no computers. You've seen that gorgeous handwriting those people were able to do? All of that was burned. Every mortgage, all your money in the bank, the records to your property was all destroyed because the courthouse was. Everything was lost. You know, of course, many of you know that you can't go back past 1871 in Chicago and get either a death certificate or a birth certificate because the records were all gone. How did they ever put that city back together again? Well, that's a great story that somebody should tell you someday, I guess. One thing that happened, I have to tell you, is that Chicago had the good sense to elect a Scottish mayor. They haven't had many. But they elected one in 1871. And he was an honest, hard-working fellow. And he got through the city council some very strict building codes. And he nor his men would take a payoff or would make a change. That's got to be unusual, I think, for the city. And he began to enforce these strict building codes, which said there will be no more wooden construction in the heart of the city. And all the people who had been living downtown moved out to the suburbs. And that's why towns like River Forest and Oak Forest and Riverside, where many of the rich had summer homes, they just went out to the summer homes and lived and never went back to the city of Chicago. In a way, it was the salvation of the city. In spite of all the loss and the tragedy and probably at least 300 people were killed. I don't think anybody will ever know how many died, but at least 300. But it cleaned out all the heart of the city, so it could be the way you see it today. And a number of things happened. First of all, they had the strict building codes. And secondly, they had electricity in a little while, and they had elevators shortly. And then somebody made a marvelous discovery that you could mix salt with your mortar and you could work past freezing temperatures. And so the construction and the building never stopped. Somewhere in my things I had a little note, I thought. I guess I don't. If you ever go down to the Historical Society, they have, after celebrating the 25th anniversary of the fire, they have a wonderful description of the fire and how the city was rebuilt. And one of the statements in that newspaper is this: there was built and completed in the burned district of Chicago a brick, stone, or iron warehouse every hour of every working day during most of 1872. Can you believe that? Every hour of every day, there was a new building that was completed in the city of Chicago. Well, in fact, by the World's Fair, 1893, the city was totally rebuilt, totally restored, and they held the World's Fair along the lakefront to show the world what had happened in just a short period of time. The resurrection of Chicago is almost miraculous, I have to tell you, in view of everything that was happening. Well, I know my time's up. Nobody set a time limit on me, but it was suggested maybe 30 minutes, and I think I've talked 40 now, and I think I'll stop. I'm not an expert on Chicago or the fire. I'm just sort of a layman. Mary and I have been working on Scottish things for about 7 years, and we're in the process now of putting all of our information together in a book that will be finished in January of 1994, a year from now, and will be published that summer by Kendall Hunt. Five? What is this, 94? Thank you very much. I'm not confused, am I? 1 year from now, we'll have our writing finished, and it'll be published by the Kendall Hunt Publishing Company in Iowa. And the story of the fire will be there. But more than that, the story of Scottish men and women in this nation, and especially in Illinois, but especially the city of Chicago. Scottish people have never really gotten credit for what they have accomplished, and we hope this book at least will do part of that. If you ever get to the Scottish Home is located in North Riverside. Mary and I live in Wheaton. If you ever get to the Scottish Home, which is a small retirement home for people of Scottish descent, stop in and have a cup of coffee. And down in our basement, we have the Scottish American Hall of Fame, and there are some 200 plaques on a wall there recognizing the contribution that Scottish men and women have made to the development of the country. We've been presently working on Cyrus Hall McCormick, and that's a most wonderful story, I think, of a Scottish man and his invention and what it meant to the development of this country. We're extremely proud of our Scottish heritage and what Scots have done. I'm very proud of the Illinois St. Andrews Society for what they've done. They've, since 1900, have operated a home for elderly Scots, and our fundraising efforts and our endowment fund now go to support the home. We take care of 13 people entirely on charity at a cost of about $30,000 a year for each of them. And all of that money is donated and contributed by Scottish men and women in the city of Chicago. They're a great group of people. They're not tight or stingy in spite of what you hear, which was really started, you know, by a comedian who made a tour of the United States, who was our comedian that was always so tight?
Jack Benny.
Jack Benny, thank you very much. He started telling Scottish stories about how tight they were with money, and so that idea has come down to the present, but it really isn't true about them. They're a wonderful group of people. Anybody have a question you'd like to ask or comment? Yes?
What was the name of the Scottish mayor of Chicago?
Medill.
Medill.
Oh. Joseph Medill. He served 1 year. It broke his health. He worked night and day, and so great was the pressure that he resigned after 1 year and really spent the rest of his life as a broken man. But he did a great service because he refused to let them not build according to the code.
Well, he was also a publisher, wasn't he?
He was a publisher of the Times or the Daily News. You're right. He was.
Was there a firebolt named after him?
Okay. I didn't know that. I'm sorry some of you have come in late. You had another meeting?
This afternoon, Joe and I watched the 1937 film of In Old Chicago,
Yes.
which is supposed to be the story of the O'Leary family.
Yes.
Was there ever an O'Leary that was in office?
Not as mayor to my knowledge, no. The one O'Leary, Big Jim O'Leary, was a politician, but I think he was not a mayor. But there again, I'm not an expert about the O'Leary family, but it'd be very easy to find out at the library because they have all the mayors listed in a book, I'm sure. Yes?
It's a very schmaltzy movie.
Was it when they rebuilt Chicago that they did that tunnel system that, when, what, 2 years ago we had that flood? And they found all of that underneath that they weren't,
The tunnel system was built as they began to build the big buildings, yes. Yeah, it was a way to move coal and supplies and things in and out of the buildings. And of course, later on, they put the electrical lines down there and the telephone lines and then sort of forgot about them, I guess. That was an interesting phenomenon, wasn't it? Anybody else? Well, I thank you very much for your attention and your kindness.
Wayne, is it true that only a Scotchman can pinch a penny so that it makes Lincoln's eyes tear up?
I'm sure that's probably true.
Well, I see that Yvonne Theory and her committee, you know, yourself, committee of one, has some refreshments there. And we're going to invite you to come up here and look at the Rams Head and talk to Wayne again, and we'll just have some refreshments. Is there anything else for the good of the cause that we just happened to overlook? Well, at that, I'm going to ask for a motion that we adjourn. breathe, stand up and stretch and greet one another.
Yeah, my husband was a dentist at Homewood.
And now this
A lot strong Homewood ties.
Did you ever have to read this kind
That's really interesting, isn't it?
It
is. They kick us off a while and camp. Were you here when
No.
No. This is man, Mr. Anderson, went back to where his family came from.
Scottish race.
And he commented to somebody there that he'd really like to have a ram like that. Take back to Chicago for the same thing. Decided they took it right off the wall of the castle. So this thing is, you know, they've got it over 100 years old, probably.
Off this after you got your supply. And here, if the snuff got hard, you use this to break it up. And then this was to open up the end of the cigars, as near as I can figure out. There isn't an instruction book with it, so we just sort of had to guess at what things are like.
Let me see if I can get the recording on the...
I don't know.
Which area of
Oh, it's hard to answer.
No, there's so much
As you come in
reflection there.
to the cemetery, you go off to the right.
The end of the horn. I've never seen anything that or, you know, put on the end of the horn.
Is that where the main entrance and the office is? Yes.
I don't want to get in front of you.